Special thanks once again to Philip Raby Specialist Cars, of course located in Emsworth. I've worked with them a number of times on the channel, mostly with Porsche models, but a couple of others as well. So of course, if you're in the market for a used Porsche, 911, Panamera, maybe something else as well, or you already own one and are looking for some professional servicing, then of course, click that link down below and check out their current stock. This particular 911 nestles perfectly between the two other 911 reviews that I've done on the channel. Of course, the first one was a 993 Carrera, and then the 997.2 Carrera. Now we have the 996. So although they don't necessarily immediately follow each other, they're pretty close in terms of the timeline. Now, this particular car is one which, out of those three for sure, was my least liked, because these cars, Porsches from the early 2000s, to me, they don't have the same feel of quality. And there are a number of reasons for that. In fact, the first Porsche that I ever drove was an early 2000s Cayenne, and I did not like it. I found it to feel somewhat underwhelming in terms of quality and feel from what I would expect from a Porsche, but at the time it made sense, because of course they'd never done anything like that before. It shared a lot of the development of the Volkswagen Touareg, which I drive myself, and the Volkswagen just feels like a more put together approach at a SUV. Of course, they also had the Boxster at the time, which was a new thing for them as well, and this car really represents a hugely significant step in the 911 story for a couple of reasons. One is, of course, that this was the first ever 911 production car to have a water-cooled engine, and some of the purists don't like it for that. Personally, I don't really care. Whatever improves the model overall is the good choice to make. Secondly, and this is something which isn't talked about as much, this was the first 911 since the original to use an entirely new chassis layout. That is massively significant for this car, because if you look at all of the previous 911s, from the original all the way up to the 993, well, they do have a very similar shape. This one, though, is a totally new era for Porsche, and at the time, they were having some financial issues, which is also one of the contributing factors to why, for instance, the Cayenne, at least the one that I drove, that initial car, doesn't feel quite up to scratch. In terms of this car, though, I mentioned in the thumbnail that I believe, despite the fact that I don't like it as much as the 993 or the 997, I believe it is a perfect entry point for a 911 owner. And there are a couple of reasons for that. Now, there are 6 things about this car in particular which I think are very, very good, and a couple of things which I can probably mention to look out for if you are on the market, since they are, around 20 years old now in the case of this one, and they are one of the more affordable 911s, which tends to indicate something about the reliability or quality. If it's affordable, it tends to be for a reason, so we're going to talk about that as well. Now, just before I get to those 6 really impressive things about the car, let's talk specs, because of course that's something which you always want to know in a car review. What's the engine, what's the power, what's the performance, that kind of fun stuff. So let's get to that. It has, of course, a rear-mounted engine. In the case of this car, it's a Carrera 4S Tiptronic in particular. So as you can see, it has an automatic shifter with the buttons on the steering wheel as well. It doesn't have flappy paddles. I believe some owners have converted it, but this one has the original buttons. In terms of the engine, it's a 3.4 litre flat 6, naturally aspirated, no turbos, no supercharging, and of course water-cooled, as I said earlier on. And incidentally, that engine leads me very nicely into one of the 6 things which I really liked about this car, especially, in fact, in comparison to the 993 and the 997, and that is the sound. The engine in this car sounds very, very nice, and I think it's a combination of reasons. One is the engine itself just sounds good, and the second reason is I think that some of the soundproofing might technically be not as good in this car compared to the 993 or the 997. Now that's only a wild guess, but it wouldn't surprise me if this car had maybe a little bit of thinner padding or the redesigned shape made it echo a little bit more, but it sounds very nice. It's deeper, it's louder. For me, the 993 sounds nice, but it's kind of muffled. The 997 has a nice bark to it, but only when you push it hard. This 996, on the other hand, well, it sounds good. In fact, it sounds like, I believe, a sports car should all the time. Moving on with those specs though, being naturally aspirated, and of course a car that's 20 years old, it's not going to have a crazy amount of power. In fact, you're looking at about 300 horsepower in this form, and that was actually an update from about 5 horsepower more from the initial specs of the engine. Now, the car is not that heavy. Even with the all-wheel drive system and the Tiptronic gearbox, it only weighs 1,320 kilos. That is very, very good and way lighter than its equivalent 911 would be today. Now that gives you fantastic performance, even with a 20-year-old Tiptronic automatic in effect. Even with only 300 horsepower, which today can easily be surpassed by certain hot hatches, sometimes by a lot, it can still hit 60 miles an hour in 5.2 seconds. That's pretty damn quick, and I think that's an impressive number for the power that it's got, and the top speed is 175 miles an hour. Now both of those numbers are really good for a 300 horsepower car, especially one which doesn't have a huge amount of torque either, 258 pound-feet, which isn't too surprising for a non-turbo 911. Now mentioning that all-wheel drive brings me to a second one of those 6 great things about the car, and that is the all-wheel drive. See, in a previous episode, I believe it was actually the 997.2 review that I did, somebody asked me in the comments, which would I actually recommend? The Carrera 2 or the Carrera 4? In other words, the rear-wheel drive 911s or the all-wheel drive? Because again, it's certainly a discussion where purists will have strong arguments back and forth, with the purity of a rear-wheel drive car and the fun factor versus the all-wheel drive launch and the safety and the grip of an all-wheel drive car. So, for what it's worth, where do I stand on the debate? Well, for me, I think there is no competition. I love the all-wheel drive, and I will choose it every time I have the opportunity. And the reasons why are very simple, especially, and here's the crucial point, in the UK. You can see from the roads that I'm driving on, from the weather that I'm in, and just from the general layout of England, all-wheel drive is always going to be an advantage. We have tighter, twistier roads, which are great fun, but having that extra grip can literally make the difference between driving in a straight line and being in a hedge in inclement weather. If it's raining, if there's mud on the road, it's just these real-world conditions wherein having that much more grip, especially over the front end, makes all the difference. Plus, it makes the hookup of power quicker. You don't have to spin up the rear wheels off the line. Now, does all-wheel drive take away some of the purist fun and some of the on-the-edge, white-knuckle, extreme driving of a rear-wheel drive sports car? Well, of course it does. So that's where it really comes down to what you want. I think a lot of owners of these aren't necessarily going to be throwing them through corners all the time. So if you are, for instance, maybe a younger driver who can afford a 911 and wants to try something, then sure, maybe go for the rear-wheel drive car if you're planning on drifting everywhere. But for those who are maybe a little bit older, who are looking for instance, maybe a weekend toy that they can cruise in, have some fun in, but also use all year round, and that's another crucial thing, well then the argument is pretty self-explanatory to me. Of course, the all-wheel drive is far more useful in the months that we're currently in, where the weather is not as good as summer, so you don't need to garage the car. You can still use it in winter, and to me that is a massive difference if you want to use your car all year round. Now, speaking once again to that performance, especially the 0 to 60 in 5.2 seconds, it highlights one of the other 6 things that I really like about this vehicle, and that is something which I'll call the pickup. Now, off the line, it's a little sluggish. 5.2 seconds is really good, but I would imagine that you'd probably need to, for instance, put it in semi-manual mode with the buttons, rev it up a little bit, then release the brake, you know, kind of like I did in my 0 to 60 video for my Touareg, and really get the advantage of all that power, spin up all 4 wheels probably, and get that great 0 to 60 time. Maybe even a little bit less, because of course Porsche more often than not undersells what their cars can do. In practice though, if you just floor it from a slow rolling start, the Tiptronic takes a second or two to really get going. Mid-range though, that's what I'm talking about, because the mid-range pickup in this car, when it comes to, for instance, already doing 30 or 40 miles an hour and then flooring it, or just rolling your foot onto the throttle and opening up that 300 horsepower, that is when it's so fun. In fact, it's when the car really feels at home, because the power and the acceleration just becomes relentless. It rolls on faster and faster, and you see that digital speedo jump by increments of 4 or 5 miles an hour to 60, 70, 80, and it's very impressive how quick the pickup of that throttle is, and it's very addictive as well. For a car that is 20 years old with 300 horsepower, it feels a whole lot quicker than you'd think it would. Another thing which I think it's very important to note actually about this car though is a less obvious one, especially when you're looking at the camera. See, the camera in this video is probably bouncing around quite a bit, and it looks almost like the car is juddering around over the road on harsh suspension. And the suspension is something that I've mentioned before, I believe, in both of my other 911 Carrera reviews, wherein it was one of my less liked points about the car. Certainly with the 997. It was a great thing when it comes to performance, but a little harsher than what I typically like for just cruising. Now, I'm not exactly sure why the camera was bouncing around so much in this video, but I have a theory. I believe it was probably because the roads were a lot emptier than they typically would be, and I was getting the opportunity to really use a lot more of its performance through corners. So I believe the camera was probably bouncing simply because I was driving faster than usual. That being said, I personally find this to be a significantly more comfortable car than both the 993 and even the 997.2, which came after it. Now, to me, that is a huge point to make note of. That could make all the difference for a potential buyer, especially an older buyer. Maybe you don't want your teeth rattled out of your head, you want something that's comfortable. And of course the ultimate choice is yours, and obviously I would recommend driving at least a couple of different 911 generations to get a feel for it, but I think that driving those 3 different Carreras in particular that I've done already, it already gives me so much perspective on the comfort factor, and this one is comfortably more comfortable than the other 2. The suspension is far softer, it soaks up a lot of the bumps in the road far better than the others do in fact, and I was really impressed and certainly surprised by that actually. Now, another thing which I think is great about the car is the way it nestles between the 2, because you can tell that there are some teething issues with it being the first brand new 911. Porsche had the financial troubles, and of course they were trying to move into new things with the Boxster, the Cayenne, etc. And that also kind of highlights what I mean about one of these 6 great points. See, everyone talks about the 996 when it comes to stuff like water cooling, or maybe being the cheaper 911, and those things are true. But there's something which a lot of people don't think about, which is also true and hugely significant from a collector's and owner's point of view. This was the last 911 before Porsche became more than a sports car brand. In effect, this is the last of the Porsche sports cars 911, because once they brought in stuff like the Cayenne, later on of course stuff like we have now, such as the Taycan, the Panamera, the Macan, Porsche is not a sports car brand anymore, and from the early 2000s that began to change. This is the last of the pure sports car 911 offerings. And for a collector, for instance, certainly a collector on a budget, well, that's a pretty significant talking point, since in effect it's kind of the old glass half empty or half full situation. Yes, you could say, oh, it's a new 911 with a new chassis and water cooling, and it lost the purity of the previous cars, and it has certain issues like the Porsche intermediate shaft bearing issue, which it does admittedly sometimes have. This one was, for instance, a little bit creaky in practice because it needed a little bit of work, which incidentally the dealership is doing before they sell the car. Those things are all true, But that's the glass half empty side of things. The glass half full is that this was the last 911 of the brand before they became more than the 911. This was the time when the 911 began to show how modern it could be, instead of just looking back and refining the existing idea. It really is a pivot point for the 911 in effect, and although you could argue that way for almost every generation, I think that this one has a pretty strong argument. What with it being around the 2000s era car as well, it's literally a pivot point between centuries. And that brings me to the last of my 6 best points about this car, and that is a fairly obvious one. In fact, you're probably surprised that I left it until last. The price. See, this is by far the most affordable 911 overall. The Carrera, or just the 996 in general, tends to be significantly more affordable used in multiple countries, in fact, not just England, than others. Now, there are some reasons for that, some which I already mentioned, and some of those were the potential downsides of the car. They are sometimes not as reliable, they sometimes have more issues, and for some people the quality might not be as good. For me, I will freely admit, I'm not a huge fan of the interior of this car, for the same reasons why I don't really like the Boxster or the aforementioned Cayenne of the time. To me, it just doesn't feel as stylish and as high quality as I would hope a Porsche would be. But maybe that's just me. I know a lot of owners don't feel that way, so it is entirely possible that that's a subjective thing. What's not arguable though is that this is by far the best beginner's 911 in terms of attaining one. See, the other 2 911 Carreras that I reviewed were a lot more expensive than this. If I recall correctly, the 997.2 was something like £35,000 and the 993 was just under 50 grand. This, in comparison, is just under 16, and on the used market, from a dealership to a private owner, higher or lower mileage, you should expect to currently, at least, pay anywhere between about £12,000 and £16,000 for a higher to lower mileage depending on the car condition. Now, I can remember not all that long ago when you could occasionally see these for about £8,000, and that highlights an important point. If you are going to get one, you probably shouldn't leave it too long, because like every 911, it will go up over time. And although admittedly a lot of that is just because of the Porsche badge and because of how iconic and collectible 911s are, it still goes to support what I just said. If you are a 911 fan, if you're in a financial position to buy one and to use one, well, pretty obviously the 996 is the way to go. Overall though, that's it for my verdict on the 996, in particular of course the Carrera 4S with that Tiptronic option, and of course they do offer it with a manual as well for those who prefer that. Overall, that's it for my thoughts though. Of course, if you are an owner, a former owner, or just a fan of the 996 or the 911 overall, tell me your thoughts down below. Do you like them? Do you dislike them? What are the best and worst points from your experience? Tell basically everyone down below for their benefit if they decide to read the comments. But of course, if you want to check out my other 911 reviews, including a couple of other Porsches like the Panamera, then click the playlist here on screen. And until next time, I'll see you then. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.